We'll begin with a word of prayer. We'll ask Danny to lead us in prayer. Amen. Well, I thought I had it on the right one, and then we're in the middle of Daniel, the 11th chapter. First of all, I want to thank everybody who's visiting with us, and sorry that you're going to be kind of in the middle of things, but perhaps that'll be beneficial nonetheless. We had just finished up Daniel the 11th chapter, verse 35, and in particular, that verse 35, some of them that are wise shall fall to refine them and to purify and make them white even to the time of the end, because it is yet for the time appointed. We are dealing with, in this time frame, Antiochus Epiphanes, the successor of the Greek, one of the successors of the Greek Empire, the Seleucids. You may have heard the term Seleucids and Ptolemies. The Seleucids in Syria to the north, the Ptolemies in Egypt to the south. Now, we're going to make a change in the 36th verse, because in that verse, we're going to find, instead of continuing with he, we find then the king shall do, and go forward from there. And I want to stop for just a minute to talk about the king. This is the opinion, I agree with it, of Haley and of McGigan, not of others. Some would continue this as being Antiochus Epiphanes. But I think if you look at it in the broad picture, we've talked about the Babylonian Empire, we've talked about the Medo-Persian Empire, we've talked about the Greek Empire, and now we're moving into the Roman Empire, in my opinion, and feel free to disagree if you wish. So we're moving on from the foregone conclusion of the end of the Seleucids. The pattern that we saw over and over, God uses kings, and then he punishes the kings, but for the wrong that they had done. So it's now time for the Seleucids to be punished for what they've done. You remember that we had finished the last time that Antiochus had tried to come down against Egypt. He just about had them. And who showed up on the shores of the Mediterranean? The Romans. Okay? And so remember we talked about it, they drew a circle around him and said he wanted some time to answer, and said he drew a circle. He said, you don't step out of the circle until you give me an answer. So he had to withdraw, and that ended up basically being the breaking of his power. He did go back to the Holy Land, and he did a lot of destruction. That's when he probably did more terrible things to the Jewish people in his anger as he returned back north to Syria. Now Daniel abruptly shifts now from the discussion of Antiochus' effort to destroy every divine semblance in Judah, and now we go to the king, not a continuation of then he. Now, again, it's kind of minor. I mean, you say, well, gee, that's a bit of a stretch, but we're going to talk just a few minutes about it. Many views have been offered. Jerome advocated that it refers to the Antichrist. I didn't realize until this time that use of the Antichrist there goes that far back. Jerome, of course, would have been, I forget what century, 2nd, 3rd century probably, wasn't it, Jerome, or 1st century maybe. At any rate, he's an early writer. Logically, this continues with the king of the north, okay, We're still talking about king of the north, king of the south. It's just we're going to be talking about a different king of the north. Remember we talked about Egypt set to the south, and always the kings coming against them would come from the north, and they would come through the promised land. That was the way they had to come. Previously, we spoke about the Seleucids being the king of the north. From this point onward, we're going to talk about the Romans as the king of the north. That's the final of the four world empires. This similar abrupt switch occurred also in Daniel 11:3 when we went from Persia to Greece. And we find the terminology, and a mighty king shall stand up. That was Alexander the Great. We already had a good discussion of the nature of the Antiochus Epiphanes and his forebears. Now we're going to even get a much greater power with even a higher, if that's possible, higher esteem of himself. In 11:3, we skipped over 6 Persian kings in a period of 134 years. So we just left them out. They were relatively unimportant, insignificant, in terms particularly of the importance. What was Daniel wanting to know? Keep repeating that because it's critical to understanding Daniel. What did Daniel want to know? Talked about it many times.
What about his people and the return?
His people, the reestablishment of the kingdom, rebuilding of the temple. That's what Daniel wasn't looking for end of the world stuff. He wasn't looking for all of this other. He was looking for my people. He knew they were still very sinful, and yet the 70 years were up. He knew that at 70 years they were supposed to be able to return, yet they really weren't ready to return. So he was very concerned about all this. So in what we're doing and what Daniel's been revealed to Daniel, it has been to answer his questions primarily about his people. So here we skip 15. Here we skipped the 6 Persian kings. Now we skip 15 minor Seleucid kings who followed Antiochus in a little over 100 years. We've already reached the zenith of the kings of the north and the south to the extent that Rome reaches now across the Mediterranean to stop a war. Now the emphasis moves on to the much greater power of Rome, while the remnants of the Greek Empire are going to disintegrate and then be absorbed into the Roman Empire. In Daniel 2, the Fourth Empire was described as being strong as iron, breaking in pieces and subduing all before it, weak in its inability to fuse its conquest into one homogeneous body. There was a stone cut without hands that would occur in the days of this Fourth Empire and would result in a contest between what I put as a physical kingdom versus a spiritual kingdom. In Daniel 7, we had a terrible and powerful and strong exceedingly description of this Fourth Empire, and it had great iron teeth, could crush into pieces all the enemy. It was diverse from all the beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. Yet amongst that there was a small horn that made war against the saints and prevailed for a time against them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. That was in verses 19 through 22 of Daniel 7. This foretold the conflict that would arise between the two kingdoms in 1136. So the little horn seems to represent the persecuting element of the emperors. Not all emperors persecuted the saints, but there were some that very definitely did, and with great horror in some instances. So in Daniel 9, 26, 27, we find Jesus quotes, let me back up from that. Jesus quotes from Daniel 9, 26, 27, when he speaks about the abomination of desolation regarding the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. In those verses, after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with flood until the end of the war desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring to an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Now, we know what that's referring to because that's Jesus talking about it. And he says this is what you'll be looking at in Matthew 24. So in Daniel 10:14, this is kind of a summary to understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for the vision is yet for many days. The third kingdom, the contemptible Antiochus Epiphanes, and his effort to destroy the kingdom of God was revealed, has now been dealt with, and now we move to Daniel 11. The latter part. The fourth kingdom has arisen, and the time has come in prophecy when the stone cut without hands will become a great mountain that filled the earth, a kingdom that would never be destroyed, and that would break in pieces those kingdoms. Those are difficult things to understand, but if we keep in mind what Daniel's purpose was, what his view was, what he was wanting to know, and thus it was revealed, then I think this fits together pretty well. In 11:36, then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god. He shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. What God has determined is going to be done. This man, these kings, these people magnified themselves above every god by deifying themselves. That's similar. Nebuchadnezzar did that, punished, and then seemed to learn his lesson. Alexander the Great did it. Probably Antiochus the Great did as well. Not quite as much, I think, emphasis on that. In Rome, the people were forced to confess Caesar is God or Caesar is our Lord under the penalty of death. They were put to death if they wouldn't confess it. Some did. Some blasphemed and said what had to be said in order to save themselves. Others did not, and they were generally martyred. No king, though, note, we've said it before, succeeds without God's, I use the term permission, I think the original quote was approval. No king succeeds without God's permission, and no nation is punished without God's permission. So we find those who are the heathens being punished. We find the children of Israel being punished. We find the heathens being punished. We find the children of Israel being punished. All of that is within God's will. It isn't the fact that God couldn't stop Rome. He was using Rome. Rome arose for a specific purpose. Filled pretty well because it managed to establish a kingdom that was covering most of the earth, means of transportation, wonderful road systems, other things, a common language. It was a perfect time for the gospel to be declared in Acts the 2nd chapter. All right. Now, he shall regard in 37 neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall exalt himself above them all. We've noted over and over the specificity of the prophecies of Daniel, and it's just remarkable. You go through them and, boy, bang, 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 and it's things that could not have been recognized prior to, but once it occurred, very like the prophecies about Jesus, once it occurred, you look and say, wow, that's exactly right. Nero particularly epitomized this aspect of the people and the ruler. He was cowardly. He committed one crime to cover another crime. He had Britannicus poisoned in AD 55, his wife. 4 years later, had his own mother put to the sword. He divorced and later put to death his wife Octavia. He killed his second wife, Poppaea Sabina, in a bit of rage. A third woman who refused to marry him, he killed. He killed the husband of a fourth woman so he could marry her. This was a man who was all about himself. He was insanely suspicious upon discovering a plot against him. He even put Seneca to death. Seneca had been a previous advisor to others and to him, a brilliant politician, a philosopher, and yet he put him to death as well as many other famous people because he suspected things were going on. And then we move to this idea of the king who honored the fortresses in 38. But in their place he shall honor a God of fortresses, and a God which his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. These gods, particularly Nero and the worst of the Roman kings, and remember, this is a far cry. I'm going to make a note of it here in a minute. Well, here it is already. Let me go forward. So, win by whatever means, using foreign gods and worshiping war and conquest. Far cry from the Roman peace, Pax Romana. You may not be familiar with that term if you've not studied the Roman Republic, but the Roman Republic was pretty good overall government, and they were known for the peace that they brought, the original idealism of the Roman Republic. Now we've gone to prosperity, and boy, that sounds familiar. It should. Prosperity has brought corruption in the Republic. Now we're moving on out in the time of the Romans, and this is the time we're talking about. The Republic ended at 43, I believe, BC, and then from that time on, we look at emperors and an empire. The prosperity had brought corruption. In the Republic, Brutus offered his sons on the altar of duty to the state. So, in other words, he dedicated his sons to that. Emperor Nero murdered his mother and wife to please another woman. Selfishness became the law of the land. The rich amused themselves with feasts. You remember the term for the poor? They had free bread and circuses. The middle class disappeared. There were only the very rich and the very poor, or the slaves. And this is kind of where we are with Rome, even from the very beginning of the empire on. So this is going to identify Rome in that first century AD. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and divide the land for the gain. Now, this is an interesting verse once you look back at the history. First of all, he's talking about a god foreign to the Roman Empire. Haley actually suggests that this may have been the God of heaven. Not that he was worshiping him, but that he was recognizing the power. So some suggest the Antichrist, others simply a different god, such as one of the fortresses. I suspect the latter is probably correct. The God of fortresses. In other words, he didn't worship any other god, but he worshiped the God of fortresses because he did believe in fortresses, and he did establish those. Talking particularly of Nero, but of the other kings as well. Now, I want to talk for a minute. This is the nature of Rome. They had client kings. Rome didn't want to wipe people out. They really ideally wanted to move in, control a nation, keep the king where he was. He maintained the peace. He paid the taxes. He kept down the nationalism. And these men were given places of leadership. They effectively became what would be considered client kings. These kings remained kings so long as they behaved themselves and kept the money flowing. The further for Rome, keep in mind, Rome's sitting up over here in Italy. I mean, all the time we've been talking about mostly at least Turkey, around Greece, and then down in the Middle East, and then back over to Egypt across the Mediterranean. I'm doing it backwards. I guess I would turn the other way. but for me it's straight. And now they're way away from the extremes of the kingdom. Now ultimately they'll spread all the way to England, so it begins to spread back that way. But for now, they're at one end of the kingdom, effectively. And so very expensive to maintain their legions far away, and it became more necessary to have sources of wealth to pay for it. Italy was a poor country. It was never a rich country. It did not have great resources. It wasn't a breadbasket like Egypt. And so every Roman of any standing seemed to be permanently short of cash. This was addressed by these client kings, by these provinces that would send money. We talked about the amount that was required of Antiochus was amounted to $1.5 billion a year was expected from them. In fact, basically Rome broke the Seleucids by taxation. Client kings governed over Armenia, Cappadocia, Galatia, Commagene. Tacitus said of Rome, it made even kings the instruments of servitude. So kind of an interesting concept as far as how they govern. And I'm sorry I'm lecturing so much. I'd prefer to be, we've got to finish today and tomorrow I've got to finish up. And so I apologize. It's not my preferred method, but it's been almost necessary through because so much of this, there's a lot of material and so much of it is not necessarily something that people are aware of. Rick?
One thing to remember, this was, all of this stuff you're talking about here with the Roman emperors and stuff, was really set in motion by the execution of Julius Caesar in the vacuum that followed with the rise of Octavian, who became Augustus and was the first to institute emperor worship, and he was probably a homosexual that was just conveniently had women around, so he didn't want women.
Okay.
He conveniently had women around so he could have a successor, but that was the beginning of it all.
All right.
That was what laid the foundation for Christ to come.
Julius?
After his death, the vacuum that was left
Yeah.
by that really was what instituted all of this following stuff.
All right, and Julius Caesar, of course, came back and crossed the Rubicon. He wasn't supposed to, and that in turn set in motion a number of things that led to the fall of the Republic and then the beginning of the empire as we establish it, as it was established at this time. All right, at the time of the end of the king of the, at the time of the end, let's read that correctly, verse 40. The king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. Now again, this is, I think, talking about the king of the south would be whom? What group? Still? Hello? Ptolemies, okay. And so the north, though, instead of being the Seleucids, is now the Romans. Okay, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. Now, who is this king of the south? It would be the same king of the south and those who followed him. Haley did feel like he had some concern there was no single operation of such a fierce character ascribed to either Syria or Egypt. But I think if we look at the overall campaign, I think it does fit in, but not necessarily to a single operation, but instead a series of wars and battles. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. Now remember, the time of the end does not mean the end of the world. And it's used differently in different ways in Daniel. 8:17 had a vision that refers to the time of the end. It was a First of all, it's a time appointed by God, and it's an end of the vision, a completing of the elements of the vision at a time that God has ordained. And each of these visions had a particular purpose. They had a particular goal. They reached the end, and that cut that off. So we determine by context. In Daniel 8, 15, 17, I think we have the end of the Seleucid kingdom, the bosses, and his persecution of the Jews. In 11:27, again, I think we have, and in both the Seleucid and the Ptolemy kingdoms. And in Daniel 12:4, I think we find that it refers to the end of the Roman and Jewish conflict, the end of the temple, the city, and the nation. In Daniel 9 and 27, and even, he said, and even until the full end, and that determined that his wrath be poured out on the desolate. All right, and that was the Jewish. The time of the end, he shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. A couple of interesting side notes here, and I think I just blew by some of my comments. Just a minute. I wanted to go back. No, maybe that's it. Back to this war between the South and the North. Before we leave that, I think this is important to note and help tie things together. So the king of the South attacked. Pardon me, I'm going to go back for just a minute. King of the South attacks. The Ptolemies move against the Romans. Now, what famous person, movie about her, was the primary force in Egypt at this stage of the Ptolemies? Cleopatra, who was actually by birth a Seleucid, okay, given in marriage. So she's the last of the Ptolemy line. And who's the character that aided her in the movie, if you've seen that or know the story? Mark Antony, okay. They began a push against Rome, which led to Rome, under Octavian, that's Augustus, declaring war against Egypt. See all that is discussed in Roman history and Plutarch's Fall of the Roman Republic. So, after a few successful land engagements against the Romans, Mark Antony is urged by Cleopatra to execute the war as predominantly a naval affair. He didn't want to, but Plutarch informs us that Cleopatra completely dominated him, and he did that. Well, Octavian gained the upper hand because he wiped them out on the sea. Well, by wiping them out on the sea, the forces on land looked and said, uh-oh, we're in trouble. And it discouraged them, and in fact, many of them went over to the Romans. That led to Antony committing suicide. Now, Cleopatra, with her allure, reached out and tried to woo Octavian, maybe for the reasons that Rick made, failed, and then she committed suicide as well. So the Battle of Actium in 31 BC ended the Ptolemy kingdom. That was the very last vestige of the Greek Empire. All right. There were other kings, but it didn't amount to much of anything. Now we move to the time of the end. All right. Let's see. There was a couple of my items I was going to add to what I'd said. Herod comes to play in this time frame. Now, this doesn't obviously talk about him, but this is where Herod comes in. He's been kind of overseeing the area of Israel. Herod takes it on himself. He'd been a friend and supporter of Mark Antony for a pretty long time, but he went to Rhodes to see Octavian. He candidly confessed to the conqueror that he had not been, if he had not been embroiled in war with the Arabs, that he would have backed Antony in the Battle of Actium. But then he asked him to remember not whose friend I have been, but remember how loyal I have been to him. Augustus apparently liked that idea. He was impressed, assured him everything was fine. Augustus accepted Herod's invitation to go to Egypt through Syria and Palestine. He entertained him there. And so we actually find that Octavian did literally come to the Promised Land and was entertained there. A little bit further on the story, to lay the framework for the New Testament, in 63 BC, two brothers were fighting over the position of high priest and king when Rome intervenes. Remember that we noted last lesson, the time before, that was the first time we could see that people were actually vying for the priesthood, and maybe the most money paid or the slickest mischievousness that they could do. They were obtaining the high priest and king over the area. So two brothers were fussing and arguing, and Pompey, the Roman general stationed in Syria, entered into the picture to save the quarrel, and he settled it. He annexed the Jewish kingdom to Rome, and then continued his conquest of many of these other countries that we're talking about. But Edom, Moab, and a portion of the children of Ammon escaped. So that's how Herod came about in this. He was a slick enough politician that even though he was loyal to Antony, he shifted to Octavian and made a pretty good go of it. Now, he's the one that you remember built the temple and did a lot of other good works, physical works, in the land of Canaan. All right, now let's go back forward. So he shall enter also into the glorious land. That's what I just covered, and these countries shall be overthrown. But Edom, Moab, and chief of the children of Ammon will be saved. And that's, I guess I just covered that, didn't I? I had it on here, I forgot. I think I already covered that slide, didn't I? All right. Upon his death, Herod's, down at the bottom of this slide, his kingdom was divided among three sons and his sister, and that was the Tetrarchy of Galilee, and then Perea. So that's the four parts that we find in New Testament days. All right, and the saving of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Again, the details that come in. Well, what happened was probably it was due to the misadventures of Aelius Gallus, who undertook an expedition from Egypt with 10,000 infantry that included 500 Jews, 1,000 Nabateans, and the guidance of a Nabatean named Silius, who deceived and misled him. So they head out into the desert. They take about 6 months to go what should have taken about 6 weeks. They have some success, but ultimately his army just falls apart due to the heat, due to the bad water, illnesses and other things, and they ultimately draw back to Alexandria without conquering Edom, Moab, and most of the Ammonite people. It's interesting that history records they weren't, where Edom and Moab were saved, most of the Ammonites, so you find chief of the children of Ammon, were not hurt or destroyed. And that's I'm ahead of myself again, sorry, from memory. All right, he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Egyptians shall be at his steps. And let's back up for a minute. What year, roughly, just ballpark, is Daniel receiving this vision? Huh? Probably about 535, 520 in that time frame. Good. And then what time is he now talking about what's happening. See, we're all the way forward. I should have double-checked myself, but I mean, we're all the way into, I don't remember the exact dates, but 40, 50, 30s, in that time frame BC. So we're almost 500 years in advance. And we're talking about specifically that this time, in the past, it had been the Egyptians primarily. The Libyans and the Ethiopians had not been mentioned, okay? Now Egypt, Libya, the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Anybody know what steps were? When the Romans conquered a country or a large area, they would have a victory march in Rome. And they would literally bring back parts of a wall, parts of a temple, other stuff, and of course slaves. And they would march with pride, a triumphant pride down, and they would show off all that they had accomplished to the Senate and the Roman people. And that was called a step. And so he makes mention that they shall be at his steps. This was what he was going to show off. So Augustus moved on into Egypt. The country surrendered. The whole landmass now came under the direct control of Rome. They had vast treasures. Rome regarded Egypt merely as a valuable granary and burdened the natives with cruel taxes. That set up in turn, so much of our history even today is affected. That set up 3 centuries of Byzantine misgovernment, followed the rule of Rome, and it left the Egyptians in a mood to open their arms widely in AD 641 to the Saracens, to the Muslims. And so that's when Egypt became a Muslim nation. That was about 9 years after Muhammad's death. All right. Now, tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him, and he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to sweep away many. Rome was in this time frame, and for some time, Germanic tribes, the Huns had come down, the Goths, the Gauls would come against them, the Parthians to the east. They were always prone to rebellion. Ultimately, I guess it was mostly the Germanic tribes that ended up overrunning Rome finally at its fall. So at this time, the Romans that's what they would not tolerate. They put up with a lot. They let people keep their own religions. They let people have their own kings. But if you violated the peace, that was a problem, just like it was in the days of Christ. And so he went rushing, and he put the hammer on them and stopped that. But then he shall plant tents of his palace between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Pompey entered the glorious land in person. His tents were planted particularly when Titus brought his Roman troops to besiege the city in AD 70. They were between the Mediterranean. If you know the geography, you have the Mediterranean, you have the plains, now you have the Shephelah, the kind of mountainous area. Jerusalem sits up, I think that's about 1,300 feet above sea level, and Dead Sea about 1,300 feet below sea level. So it sits up high. And so in some of the versions say seas, so perhaps it would be the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea. But nonetheless, his troops sat there and besieged the city in AD 70. As a statement of fact, I don't think it's so much that it's happening right this instant. Once these people had fulfilled God's intent, they too would be punished, and none would be able to help them. I think none shall help him. He shall come to his end. Not at that immediate time. Rome lasted until about 430 or 40, this part of Rome, till about 430 AD, somewhere in that area. But there are none that are so great that they are beyond God's power. So we also find the revelation of the conflict between Jehovah Revelation deals with, the conflict between Jehovah and the gods of the pagan world powers, with the final showdown in the conflict between Christ. This is our tie back to Revelation. Excuse me, Bertha. I have a habit of like something saying the plural, and it's not. Revelation it draws a lot on Daniel because there is some similar things that are going on. But also it uses an echo of prophetic language as well. And I just lost my podium, didn't I? See if I can get it back. I'm not connecting. There we go. Get that out of the way. All right. Revelations 12, 1 through 6, and 13, 1 through 18. Satan sought to destroy the woman with beast as after failing to kill the child. Beast out of the sea, the political power in the earth, false religion, or including emperor worship. I think that was Haley's take on it. 19, 11 through 12, we have a war between Messiah and the evil powers. Ends by them being cast into the lake of fire. So that ultimately, the lake of fire, I think, goes to the end of time, and I think Revelations does. But most of Revelations ends up dealing with these things are going to come to pass shortly in Revelation 1. So most of that is being reflected and is actually tied to some of these last prophecies of Daniel. I'm almost out of time. We'll push forward. Well, I went backwards. Just a minute. Let me see if I can. There we go. (12:1). We get into the 12th chapter. I hope we would, and then we'll finish it up on Wednesday night. It'll be a push. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince who standeth for the children of thy people. Remember, we've had so many great things about Michael. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Again, go back to Matthew 24, tribulation such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. It's proverbial language, but Jesus was using it, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. At that time would be when Rome would establish its authority and its presence in Israel. Michael, whose name means who is like God, is God's representative. And this is the time that leads up to and includes the breaking in pieces of the power of the holy people, the terrible conflict between the Romans and Jews. This is when Jesus was answering the question about the temple. He said, no stone will be left upon another. This is when the temple was destroyed, the city was destroyed, and the Jewish system as such completely wiped out. Now they began to meet in synagogues, took an entirely different form. So Michael is the one who leads God's people to the final victory when the old serpent is cast down in Revelation 12, 7 through 9. And I guess maybe we can go one more. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince who standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation. That's what we'd already read, wasn't it? So this is, and everyone this is Revelations, such as never was since there was a nation, even to the same time. And at that time the people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Okay, we're going to stop at this point, but that was Daniel 12. I should have said 1. And we'll pick up at that point on Wednesday night and finish the 12th chapter.